What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of The Sit Down. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of the discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button now so you never miss another sit down video. Also, guys, I'm going to ask for a favor. I recently created a Facebook group here for the channel. In the description below, you'll find that Facebook group. I know a lot of folks that watch these videos have Facebook, and it'll allow me to share more stuff from the show, fun facts about the mob and other organized crime, and so on. So make sure you share and follow the Facebook group in the description of this video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get in to another very interesting organized crime topic. And over the years in the mafia, we have heard of many celebrities connected to the world of organized crime. Everybody from Joe DiMaggio to Frank Sinatra to James Caan to Joe Namath to Donald Trump. We've heard it all. But what about one of those more negative connections to the mafia? Today, we're going to get into one of the more interesting ones involving a member of the action film industry. And we're going to talk about the guy that essentially was behind most of it. The story of the forgotten rat, Primo Casarino. Next on Sit Down Shorts. Primo Casarino was born April 26th, 1956 in Brooklyn, New York. He would grow up at that time in the quaint Italian enclave of Carroll Gardens, which at the time, if you know anything about the 50s and 60s in that area of Brooklyn, it would be controlled by the Joey Gallo crew. As we know, Gallo and his brothers and henchmen were wide-ranging, important people in the Carroll Gardens, Red Hook area. Now, the thing about Casarino, down the road, there was also a lot of Gambinos in the area, and that's kind of where he would become connected with the mafia. Now, for Casarino, his family, most of them, including his father, were actually longshoremen on the Brooklyn waterfront. For him, though, he decides pretty early that he's likely going to go into that same business. The thing about Primo Casarino, though, was he also liked crime. Casarino would get started very early as a teen in the early 70s, running with a local street gang, robbing people, and committing different types of fraud. Casarino, we would learn pretty quickly, was a major hothead. He had major issues with a foul mouth and liked to beat people up. And he would act essentially as a bagman his entire life. For Casarino, he decides in his head that, hey, I need to do something else with my life, or at least try to. I'm going to enter the military. In the early 70s, he would enter the military. Now, during that time, though, it's important to realize he actually had begun his connection to the mafia already, running around with the Gambino crime family, working in a meat market. But he would enter the Marines, but it wouldn't last long. Casarino would be discharged and kicked out of the Marines after he was arrested for assault. He would head back to Brooklyn and get a job on the waterfront with his family, though his connection to the mafia would continue. As many of us know, just because you have a legitimate job does not mean you can't be connected to the mob. Casarino would begin hanging around a social club in the area of Carroll Gardens on Court Street, in a social club belonging to longtime Gambino heavyweight Sonny Chacon. Sonny Chacon would act as a quasi-mentor to Primo Casarino. And for Casarino, this was a good person to know, because if you know anything about Sonny Chacon, Chacon essentially throughout the 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s was the liaison for the Gambino crime family on the Brooklyn waterfront. He controlled the International Longshoremen's Association and was very connected in all the unions down in the waterfront. These are the types of people that made John Gotti and down the road Junior and Peter Gotti into rich men. People like Sonny Chacon who could make money on the waterfront. For Casarino, though, he would again continue his abilities to get legitimate jobs, get pensions, get successful employment, but also have a connection to the mafia. He would get a job in the Department of Sanitation. Down the road, though, he would actually be involved in a injury case where he would continue to collect a pension deep into his life. So, Casarino was a smart guy. He was definitely making the right connections. He had money coming in. He was also making a lot of money in the mafia through gambling, loan sharking, card games. One thing about Chacon, he was also maintaining gambling clubs in and around his social club in Brooklyn. And at one point, by the mid 80s, Chacon essentially becomes Chacon's right-hand man. And by the early 90s, Chacon gets into a beef and gets arrested and actually starts passing all of his messages exclusively through Casarino. Casarino starts running an executive card game in and around the social club, and Casarino knows Chacon knows he can trust Casarino. So things were good for Primo Casarino. He was becoming a bagman, a henchman enforcer. He had money coming in, and things were working out for him. One thing Casarino was also doing, though, is through several associates and friends that he had in and around Brooklyn, he was also making a lot of money by forming a very violent armed robbery crew. He was regularly committing armed robberies on different high-level places such as homes, commercial businesses. He was kicking up and making money. And again, guys, we talk about the wheels that turn these families. These kind of guys, these associates, they're the ones that become soldiers. They kick up and ultimately become high-ranking. And we've talked about it. When you can do both, earn, make money, and hurt people, you're going to be a very important part of the mafia. And Primo Casarino absolutely was. By 1999, he would become the next in line, and it would be called in April 1999 to get his button. Casarino would talk very openly that night he would be picked up by an individual called Joseph Sonny Giuliano and taken to the home of one of Giuliano's family members. That night, Primo Casarino would get his button. Now, interestingly enough, he would talk pretty openly down the road about that night he would be made. Casarino would say, quote, "There was a basement with a bunch of guys sitting around a table. They told me to sit down, and I sat down. Longtime member and old school boss Joe Arcuri would ask me, quote, 'Do you know why you're here?' I told him no. 'We heard some good things about you,' he said. 'Do you want to join our secret society?' I told him yes. He then said to me, he says, 'Okay.' He put a picture of a saint in my hand, pricked my finger with a pin, a knife on the table. He put the saint on fire and said, quote, 'You should burn like the picture of your saint if you break the code of omerta.' Went like they figured it would. Joe Arcuri would make Primo Casarino a made man in the Gambino crime family. Remember, Casarino was really, when we look at, I think, the next in line in the 90s and early 2000s, he was definitely a strong member on the surface. He would make a lot of money, not only through the waterfront for Chacon and other people, but he had the violent armed robbery crew. He was running card games. He and Chacon would also go into business with multiple restaurants, including a place on Staten Island called Brioso. And we thank LCN Blogspot for the photo and some of the good information on Primo Casarino. Things are good for Chacon. He had his man on the docks. He was getting money from Casarino. It was a great kind of grouping for both of them. Now, in late 1999, Casarino would be called on by Chacon to take on an even bigger role. At the time on the docks at the Brooklyn waterfront, the main man, the guy that was there when Chacon wasn't, was an individual called Anthony Pancini. He was a Gambino associate and kind of the point man. Well, he was beginning to withhold money, and Chacon would have him beaten and essentially demoted. He was chased from the crew. Casarino would step up and now be the man. He went from being an associate to the point man on the docks, essentially, for the Gambino crime family. The thing about Chacon was, at this point, he was so under the microscope, he had to dole out duties to people like Casarino. Casarino eventually owns and creates a social club on 82nd Street and 17th Avenue in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. That's essentially where this part of the Gambino crime family is run out of. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Casarino's behavior. he was very much known throughout Brooklyn and in the family as a, quote, violent hothead. At one point, his own lawyer would say, quote, he had the foulest mouth in Brooklyn. At one point, law enforcement would even see him on wiretap and hear him on wiretap kind of berating a debtor who owned them. Every other word in Casarino's lingo was F this, F that, F this, F that. It was essentially what a gangster spoke like. But Casarino definitely had no problem hurting people and had no problem breaking your balls when you owed him money. Now, I do want to talk about kind of the celebrity part of this, because at the beginning I talked about celebrities' roles with the mob. Now, one of the more subtle connections that a movie star had with the mafia was actually action film star Steven Seagal. We'll relate this to Casarino in just a second, so bear with me. Steven Seagal in the late 90s and early 2000s would become close with an individual from New York City called Julius Nasso. Now, Nasso was an associate, knew people in the family, was very close to Sonny Chacon, but had kind of made his way through the legitimate film world. At some point, he becomes a high-level film producer and becomes very close with Steven Seagal. Together, the two in Nasso and Seagal would actually even create a film company called Nasso Seagal Productions. Things were good for the two. They began planting out what they were going to do next. They create 4 films, essentially, ideas for films. And at some point, the relationship becomes severed between Seagal and Nasso. Now, Nasso believes that Mr. Seagal owes him $3 million for essentially breaking the contract that they had to make films. So what does Nasso do? He goes to members of the Gambino crime family and says, hey, look, Steven Seagal owes me a ton of money and he's not paying me. We need to kind of deal with him at some point. At one point, Nasso would tell Sonny Chacon, quote, you really got to get down on him. I know this animal. I know this beast. You know, unless there's a fire under his ass, he's not going to pay. Now, Nasso wasn't asking for the full $3 million. He wanted $150,000 for each picture they didn't make. So he wanted, essentially a 600K or so. So Nasso consults with his Gambino family buddies, including his brother Vincent Nasso, who was an associate as well. Chacon decides, all right, I'm going to deal with this dude. I'm gonna handle this. Him and Casarino would actually go to the premiere of the film Exit Wounds in 2000 in Toronto, and kind of just from afar leans on Seagal, gives him some glaring looks, and kind of makes it clear that, hey, they're not going away. They're going to attempt to extort a film star in Steven Seagal. Now, that would not stop for Seagal. Eventually, Seagal would start to be kind of, pummeled a little bit more from these guys, including Chacon. In summer of 2001, Chacon would set up a meeting with Seagal for a dinner at their restaurant, Brioso. He would begin leaning on Seagal and essentially say, if you don't pay me, I'm going to kill you. This spooks Seagal, and he runs to Genovese associate and now made man Angelo Prisco. He and Prisco had a relationship, and he tries to get Prisco to smooth this situation over. This situation was very real for Steven Seagal. At one point, as I said, Chacon essentially said, if you don't pay me, I'm going to whack you. And this was a very real extortion attempt on Steven Seagal. Primo Casarino was right there during this and acted as muscle in this situation. So we hear about all these positive involvements with gangsters and celebrities. This was not one of the better ones. Steven Seagal had a lot of kind of controversies in his career. This was one of the more negative ones. Now, ultimately, as we know, Steven Seagal is still alive. We'll get to what ultimately happens with Seagal and this group in just a second. But for Casarino, this was a very colorful part of his life. He would attempt to extort a high-level action film star. Now, the boss of the family at the time for the Gambinos, once all this is going down, is Peter Gotti. And what exactly is happening with the federal government is they want Gotti, they want Chacon, they want Casarino. So they start bugging ILA offices, they start bugging ILA officials, and they're starting to very much build a case against Casarino, Chacon, and Peter Gotti on the docks. They believed that Peter Gotti was very much connected with this because he was the boss. He was taking tons of payments from not only his brother, but they were actually coming from Chacon and Casarino. Sadly, though, for this group, in June of 2002, Casarino, Peter Gotti, and Sonny Chacon, alongside 14 or so others in the Gambino crime family, are indicted in a wide-ranging indictment, including labor racketeering, extortion, and other mob crimes. The writing was on the wall for Casarino. He would have to actually pay for some of his behavior. He had went from becoming a military discharger because of assault to an associate in the mafia to a very successful rich earner in the mob to a made man to one of the higher ranking people in a very high ranking crew that ran the waterfront for the Gambinos. Now, Casarino ultimately would discuss a very interesting scene he would see inside a meeting room at MDC Brooklyn, where Peter Gotti, as we know, would essentially tell the family that none of us are going to accept plea deals. Peter Gotti, at one point, according to Casarino, would signal to Chacon and motion with a gun and say, quote, "Anybody takes a plea, like them and their family, kill them and their family." He made sure Jerry Brancato and other people, including Chacon, didn't take a plea. Now, this is something that we've always been fascinated by with the Gotti family. They always had these rules, except they didn't actually follow the rules. And that goes all the way back to the 70s. John Gotti had this edict for not taking pleas. We don't take pleas. If you take pleas, you're a dead man. Even though in the 70s, he absolutely took a plea in the James McBratney hit. So definitely very hypocritical as usual from the Gottis. But ultimately, all the people in this indictment would go to prison. Primo Casarino would be sentenced to 11 and a half years in federal prison. At his sentencing, he would tell the judge that, quote, his mob life was finished. And he would tell his children at the time to don't be like him and make a life for yourself. For Casarino, though, he didn't want to go to prison. And upon sentencing of 11 and a half years, he did a Joey Massino. He decides to cooperate with the federal government. Now, for Casarino, he would be kind of lost in the many Gambino crime family members that would cooperate with the federal government. We've heard the names: Mikey Scars, Sammy Gravano, John A-Light, John Gotti Jr., Fat Dom Borghese. All of these people have talked to the federal government and were even on the stand, a lot of them, in the federal government. Casarino is one that we don't normally talk about because he did it after the fact that he was sentenced. Casarino, though, would play an interesting part in some other prosecutions, including the Genovese crime family. He would testify against several members in the North Jersey faction, including a very powerful individual called Lawrence Ricci, who essentially ran the New Jersey waterfront. So Casarino would play pretty well for the federal government. On August 28th, 2007, Primo Casarino, due to his cooperation, would be sentenced to time served, and he would enter the witness protection program. The last time I checked, Primo Casarino was alive and well and living somewhere in America. An interesting life he definitely lived, and he hasn't turned up yet on YouTube. We wonder if he will. I'll tell him this: several of these individuals do watch our shows, so I will tell Primo, get in touch with me. You can find my contact information in the description below. I'd love to speak to you. We can make you anonymous, and we'll come to wherever you are. A pretty interesting life, even a man who one time extorted a movie star in Steven Seagal. I hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another sit-down video. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.